Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports, History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Blake Scott Ball, the author of Charlie Brown's America, The Popular Politics of Peanuts. This is his first book. He's a professor of history at Huntingdon College in Montgomery, Alabama. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Ball.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. The great thing about a comic strip is that politics have nothing to do with it, right? You can open up the funnies and transport yourself to a mental place where nostalgia for a tranquil America rules, where we can absorb pop culture without ever having to think about the issues that divide us: race, war, abortion. Wait, did I just say all that? Well, Dr. Ball argues that, indeed, despite its reputation, Peanuts was politics, and politics was Peanuts. His book argues that by taking on the, quote, wishy-washy appearance of being apolitical, Charles Schultz made his comic strip a perfect analogy for the politics of the middle and late 20th century. So first of all, when did you realize, Dr. Ball, that we needed a whole book on something as teeny tiny as a comic strip?
Well, I've always been enamored with thinking about how pop culture, passing commercials and fads actually reveal deeper things about who we are, what we need, what scares us, what we hope for. I was always that friend in my friend group in college that everybody felt like I just took things way too seriously. No one
doesn't sound familiar at all.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No one's that deep in analyzing a Ford commercial, but that was the thing. It always struck me all the way back to my childhood. Peanuts struck me as unique on the comics page, oftentimes because it seemed to go over my head. I would have a hard time understanding, is it supposed to be funny, or is it supposed to be sad, or and Charles Schultz's confidence in just being willing to not be funny sometimes was just really different. And so yeah, it was some point in grad school that I started to put kind of my interest in history together with my childhood intrigue with Peanuts, and start asking, well, what was it about this quirky, odd strip that connected with the biggest comic strip audience ever?
When I think about comic strips, I think about picking up the daily news that my dad got every day. It was 50 cents. I lived in New York, and I remember, I'd page through it every day, and I had kind of an order. I did the sports page first, and then I did the letters to the editor, and then I'd go back to the news. But there was always a shot there at the end to run through some of the comic strips. And I have this feeling of reading, Peanuts and all the other ones with the newsprint on your hands, right? What is your experience and memory of picking up Peanuts as a kid?
Yeah. Didn't Seinfeld joke one time that maybe the New York Times should come with a wet one?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And I know Seinfeld, so yes, he did. I can confirm he joked about that. What was your experience?
So my parents were not big news readers when I was a kid. Kind of a working class family, but my grandmother did take the newspaper, and she would save it each week we would go on Sunday afternoons. We'd go over to her house for lunch, and she would bring out she would save the comic pages from throughout the week, because she knew I loved to draw. I loved cartoons. So she would save those for me. And my memory is, the same sort of feeling of the page and the ink on your fingers. But reading through the comics, laughing, enjoying some of the adventure of Prince Valiant or some of the Phantom. But then something about Peanuts. Some of my earliest memories of Peanuts is actually taking the comic strip to my grandmother or to my parents and saying, can you explain to me what's funny about this? Because I just felt like Peanuts was saying something deeper, and I could tell it was there, but I couldn't tell what it meant. I couldn't tell. And I thought maybe the adults knew better than me how to read this little cartoon.
When I think of Peanuts, I think about, of course, Charlie Brown is perhaps the most famous cartoon of all time, maybe the most famous human invention of a person or a character that everybody probably knows. I can't imagine there's anybody who doesn't know something about Charlie Brown. I always think of their outfits, Lucy's outfit and Charlie Brown's outfit and the scarf on Snoopy. What do we need to know about Peanuts? Describe Peanuts for those of us who may need a little bit of a refresher course.
Well, Peanuts is the product of one man named Charles Schultz. Charles Schultz wrote Peanuts from October 1950 until his death in February of 2000. It was a daily mainstay. The story revolves around a series of characters. Charlie Brown at the center, who's kind of the glue. He's a perpetual loser. Nothing ever seems to go right for him. He's filled with anxieties, but there's still something sort of a everyman likability about him. Other characters, his dog Snoopy, who lives this vibrant, vivacious, sometimes otherworldly life far beyond the doghouse, but then also spends most of his afternoon sleeping on top of the doghouse. Yeah. There's Lucy, who's domineering, and there's Linus, who is philosophical, and there's Peppermint Patty, who is this interesting, sometimes androgynous sort of character who can do it all on the sport field, but she can't do math so well in the classroom. So many different characters, and really the whole point of it is this story about how children can cut to the heart of the truth about the adult world in ways that adults sort of tiptoe around or try to paper over. These children are just remarkably sincere and honest.
I always ask our historians what their sources are for this. So beyond the comic strip itself, for the books that they write, beyond the comic strip itself, and have you read, just real quick, have you read every single Peanuts comic strip?
Yes.
Every one of them. And how many are there? Tens of thousands.
Yes. There's the number is somewhere just over 17,000.
And you've seen every one of them.
Yep.
Awesome. So what are your sources beyond that, though? I was amazed, and I want to have you answer the question, who is George Schultz, as part of this question. But I was amazed to see in the book that there are actual George Schultz archives, that people thought that his correspondence must be preserved. So explain the sources for this, because I think this is just fascinating.
Yeah. So Charles Schultz comes from Minneapolis, Minnesota, but eventually makes his way out in the late 50s to the West Coast, just north of San Francisco and Santa Rosa, California. And so at the time that I was embarking on the research for this, a key source obviously was the comic strip. I was sort of looking at that as sort of a almost a daily time capsule of the 50 years of the second half of the 20th century. But also, not too long before I got into pursuing this project, the Schultz family had opened up a museum and archive in Santa Rosa, California, just down the street from where his old studio had been. And what they had were decades of mail, of scripts for the TV specials, original drawings, notebooks, calendars where he kept his work schedule out year after year, all sorts of memorabilia and things, business records. It really was incredible the amount of stuff that they had kept, and so a key source for me was fan letters, correspondence, as Americans wrote to Schultz to tell him what they thought of Peanuts, what they read in the comic strip he was producing.
So how did Charles Schultz's politics, and describe his politics, but how did they make their way into this cartoon?
Yeah. Well, you asked Charles Schultz what his politics were. He would give you some kind of waffling Charlie Brown-esque answer. And so much so that one interviewer, Gary Groth, in the 1980s, mentioned to Schultz, he said, I can't really pin Peanuts down. There's something liberal to it. There's something conservative to it. And Schultz chimed in and said, yeah, it's sort of a wishy-washiness, isn't it? Charles Schultz Charles Schultz politics were very much the sort of politics of mid-century America. His father had been a small business owner, a barber, and was staunchly Republican. Schultz was himself, the only time he really ever identifies himself politically, he calls himself an Eisenhower Republican. But what we see in the comic strip is sort of two things going on. Number one, Charles Schultz is expressing through these characters. He's expressing himself. Folks often would ask, "Are you Charlie Brown?" Or and his response
is this autobiographical? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And his response often was, "Well, Charlie Brown is a part of me, but so is Lucy, and so is Snoopy, and so is Peppermint Patty, and so there are elements of his personality that are expressed, and moods of his that are expressed in these different characters. And in that same way, there are elements of his thoughts and reflection on the changing nature of American life over this period in these characters. But the second thing that Schultz was doing was he was connecting with his audience. The people who were picking up the newspaper strips were households that were interested not just in the funny pages, but in the happenings of the world, in the news. And so Peanuts was engaging with the things that people cared about, the questions and challenges that were coming up for newsreaders. And so it's almost natural that politics would, in one way or another, kind of seep their way into this comic strip.
It reminds me a lot. This story reminds me a lot of how media, because let's just take the broadcast networks. There are only 3 or 4 channels. Mm-hmm. And so media really had to work hard not to offend people. Things are very different today. Does that resonate with you and how George Schultz had to write and draw Charlie Brown?
Yeah, absolutely. So Schultz said on a number of occasions, my number one job is to help editors sell newspapers. Said if the type of material that I take on or put into the comic strip is offending the audience, then I'm not doing my job. That was the way he looked at it. Now, as I found in my research, that didn't mean that there were never times that he decided to take stands that could be controversial in the comic strip, but he very much was intent upon how can I reach as broad an audience as possible. That was really the goal of media at the time, and the belief was that you did that by staying sort of as vanilla as possible. Now, Schultz really challenges that in some ways, not necessarily by staking out hardline positions, like, say, a Doonesbury comic strip might later on in the Watergate era, but instead sort of asking provocative questions, suggesting provocative conversation, not necessarily staking out a position, but getting the ball rolling in conversation.
The question then becomes, could a comic strip start now? I mean, never mind the difference in the way newspapers are circulated now, and the numbers have changed so much. But could a comic strip start now and take on politics and be broadly successful?
I think it would be extremely challenging, because as you suggested, we have sort of reoriented our media consumer model to be one that focuses very heavily on extremes, taking loud, direct, definitive positions on one side or the other. There's a marketability to sort of stratifying your audience, so that you get the most devoted niche audience. But I think it would take someone sort of really almost willing to be loved and hated by different groups on different dates. You would have to sort of embrace the fact that you're never going to please people 100% of the time, and really sort of win the audience through, I think, sincerity. And I do think that there's a desire in American culture today for a level of sincerity that doesn't necessarily care about which partisan group that lines up with.
Give us some examples. There are a few that I want to run through here of how he took on politics. I thought the Vietnam aspect of this was fascinating. They always say that children are the ones who need the most attention during a war because it's such a big picture thing, and it's bigger than, frankly, any adult can grasp. But for children, it's completely overwhelming. So how did, particularly Snoopy, how was Snoopy used as the vehicle to try to explain some semblance of reality when it came to Vietnam?
Yeah. Well, I think you're exactly right that war is a particularly difficult thing to process, and the Vietnam War, especially with all of the sort of there was a sort of coming of age of American society in that period, and realizing that wait a second, our leaders might actively lie to us about these things we were willing to trust, and we've been misled, and at our expense. and at the expense of people in an impoverished nation on the other side of the planet. That was a tough thing to process. And Charles Schultz knew war firsthand. He had been drafted just out of high school into World War II. It was really, he described it as a very lonely and pretty terrifying experience. He grew up a lot during that period, but he also it developed in him a sort of empathy for the experience that young soldiers were going through. And so what we see in Snoopy in 1965, Charles Schultz sort of lands on this new imaginary character. Snoopy had always had a big kind of imagination and thought life. But in 1968, Snoopy had always had a very active imagination. But in 1965, Schultz lands on this new innovation of Snoopy as the World War I flying ace. And it has a pretty simple origin. Schultz had been watching some old black and white war films with his son, and one of them, they would squabble for years about which one, but one of them mentioned how funny it would be to see Snoopy in a dogfight. And so that's where the idea comes from. Really, at the start, has nothing to do with the Vietnam War. It's just an adventure idea for Snoopy. But as time moved on, from 1965 into 66 and 67, and Vietnam, if you're following the war in the media at this time, there's this growing question among the American public of what exactly is going on over there. What's happening here? Because they had been sold sort of a minor thing, and it seemed rather insignificant. The Johnson administration seemed pretty adamant about sort of keeping it out of the spotlight, but increasingly more. The draft numbers are going up, the death tolls are going up, and Americans are beginning to question what exactly is happening in South Vietnam. And so what we see in Snoopy and these flying ace stories is that they become more and more bleak. In fact, instead of like early on when Snoopy would narrate the adventure to the audience, we begin to see actually what is going on in Snoopy's head. We begin to see it in the panels, the bullet holes in the side of the doghouse, the smoke and fire from his crash, the barbed wire, the explosions of artillery fire, and the trenches, and all of these sort of really dark and despairing images, and Snoopy becomes more and more just exhausted by this. He starts off with this famous saying, anytime the Red Baron would shoot him down, he'll curse you, Red Baron. But by late 67 into 68 and 69, the saying has morphed into curse this stupid war. And it's never directly sort of implemented as a comment on Vietnam. But the analogy is very obviously there, and there are those in the audience who are picking up on this. There's a whole stream of other events in this period. For example, the flying ace Snoopy finds himself a prisoner of war at one point, which was a big element of the Vietnam War. We find that Charlie Brown on a number of occasions anxious and worrying about what happens if he gets drafted. In fact, in a conversation with Linus, Charlie Brown says, "Hey, what happens if we get drafted?" And Linus responds, "Well, I think they send you off someplace." And Charlie Brown says, "Yeah, that's exactly what I was afraid of. They would send me off somewhere that I didn't want to be." And so there was so much sort of deep, kind of bleak conversation about this in the strip. Snoopy ends up entangled in the middle of a anti-war protest, and by 1970, the Flying Ace becomes a war deserter and stops fighting the war altogether. When asked about this years later about what was going on there and why Schultz at this time where Snoopy was as popular as ever, and the Flying Ace was one of his most popular sort of alter egos. Why did you stop in the middle of this? And Schultz said, it was by 1970, it was a time where we were realizing this was just such a horrific war that it was not the kind of thing to be making light of or making central to the strip anymore. So even in Schultz's mind, regardless of whether the Flying Ace had started as a comment about the Vietnam War, it had certainly become, in the mind of Schultz and his readers, a sort of expression and chronicling of the emotion of the Vietnam War.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Franklin, nothing is more difficult for Americans to talk about than race. You certainly can't talk about the second half of the 20th century, or maybe any half of any century here in the United States, if you're not going to talk about race. How was Franklin brought into the strip? What made, it's hard to believe a comic strip had to be integrated.
Yeah.
And maybe some of them still do today. How did he come up with the idea for Franklin? Who was Franklin? And how did George Schultz take on race?
Yeah. So to set the context there, the same issue, the same logic that had set up this sort of broad-based, vanilla, inexpensive or inoffensive approach to mass media had led to some really odd outcomes in the area of race. Through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, there is a broad sort of grasping in white America and American media that the portrayals of Black characters have been and not just Black characters, but Asian characters and Native American characters. These portrayals have been insensitive, inaccurate, harmful to American culture. And so there's really a backing away from those older stereotypes of Black characters. The problem was, in an environment where being as inoffensive as possible was viewed as the key to success, no one was willing to take the risk of introducing the next, the replacement, a more accurate, a more sensitive, a more honest portrayal of Black Americans. And so by the mid 1960s, you really have a media landscape that is almost completely lily white. One commentator of the time remarked that if you were watching Lassie, a TV program like Lassie, you would assume that there are no Black people in that world. And so it's in this context that Charles Schultz receives a letter from a former teacher who has decided to be a stay-at-home mom for her 3 young kids. Her name is Harriet Glickman. She's from Southern California. She just passed away just a few years ago, but she writes because she is concerned about this very thing, that the media that is available to her kids does not reflect the diversity that they see in their community in Southern California. And so she writes asking if Schultz would be willing to introduce a Black character, but also other characters of other races and identities. Schultz writes back and says, this is in 1968, so this is still a big political issue, obviously, and a particularly perplexing issue at this moment, because you've had the Civil Rights Act in 64, you've had the Voting Rights Act in 65, but then in 66 and 7 and 8, you're having urban unrest, violence and riots in Detroit and Los Angeles and or Watts neighborhood and other cities across the country. And so there's this real urgency of this issue. Charles Schultz writes back and says, I totally agree with you. I think you're absolutely right. He said, but my concern is that I'm not the right person to do this. He says that specifically because he's afraid that he is going to, there's a danger that he would be patronizing to the Black readers of American newspapers. Harriet Glickman was a very persistent lady. She was the child of Jewish immigrants who had been labor organizers. They knew how to fight through a no, and she recognizes in Schultz's response that it was at least not a total no, because he agreed with her viewpoint. He just was unsure about being the vehicle for this change. And so she writes back again, and she says, I'm so glad to hear that you're of common mind on this issue. And I understand your concerns about how it might be read by Black Americans, but how about this? What if I got some of the families in our neighborhood, Black Americans who have children of their own, what if I got them to write you some letters to express in their own voice what it would mean to them for peanuts to be integrated? Schultz says, sure, that I'd love to read that point of view. So sure enough, she sends along a couple of letters. Apparently, there were a few more that were in the works that never made it in the mail. Glickman sort of rushed the thing because in that summer, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated following the California Democratic primary, and Bobby Kennedy had been a leading figure in civil rights politics, and so she sends these letters along. Schultz is deeply moved, and decides to introduce a character. He writes back to Glickman and says, "Hey, keep an eye on the newspaper in the end of July. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised by what you see."
And how did he write Franklin? How was Franklin portrayed?
Yeah. So with Franklin, Charles Schultz created a character who was in many ways intended to be sort of a standard bearer. He is kind. He is friendly. He is one of the smartest kids in the class. He is athletic. He is well-rounded. He is a sort of he becomes a dear confidant to Charlie Brown. Now, in some ways, this created a challenge for Schultz, kind of a catch-22. The key to the Peanuts characters had always been their character flaws, right? Charlie Brown's flaws in this sort of constant battles with a lack of self-confidence, Lucy's flaws in being so bullheaded that she can never admit that she's wrong on a thing, and yet here you have Franklin, a character who in many regards needs to be near perfect to combat earlier stereotypes of Black figures, and yet because of this, he struggles to sort of falls short of being exactly an accurate portrayal of Black American life, but also you can see for a number of years that Schultz struggled with exactly how to implement him into the story. Schultz wrote his stories from through the characters. He would think of a situation, put a character into that situation, and then write the story from there. How does this character handle this oddball situation? Well, Franklin was kind of there's not a lot of story fodder there in the Peanuts kind of world, and so you can see Schultz sort of struggling with how to keep this character going over the years. That said, Schultz does run into some pushback, not from the introduction of the character. Initially, Charlie Brown meets Franklin on beach vacation in the summer. The two boys get along. It's
a very California story.
Yeah, they're the best of friends. They build a sandcastle together, but things get more dicey when Franklin then in later months moves to Charlie Brown's neighborhood and starts going to school with the kids. And Schultz, as he often was, very subtle with this. There was no controversy. There were no protesters. Franklin just one day appears in the classroom, sitting at the front of the class and ahead of the white students. And Schultz editors start getting mail from newspaper editors in states like Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, complaining that those states were in 1970 and 71. They're in the midst of school desegregation fights still. Is it as hard to believe as that is? We get Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 and 1970. The southern states are still fighting it. And these southern editors write and say, look, either you stop showing white children in the classroom together, this very controversial imagery right now, or we're going to stop running Peanuts in our newspaper. The editor calls Schultz and tries to sort of see if there's any wiggle room. Is there any way Franklin in and of himself is not controversial, but the schoolroom scenes are controversial? Is there any way that we could avoid the schoolroom scenes? And Charles Schultz, who was typically very mild, very reasonable, liked to get along, did not like to push buttons, especially on the business side. He says very directly, I write scenes the way I write them. Either you publish them that way, or I quit and I'll find another publisher that will publish them that way. And that was sort of the end of that.
We all want to sell newspapers.
That's right. That's right.
The mighty dollar. How did the strip go into the 80s and 90s? And, he didn't die till the year 2000. I mean, I'm asking a very big question there, but, as the country turns rightward during the Reagan years, how does he start to adapt his characters and his strip? As an aside, it's just interesting that even though time marches on in America, he can keep drawing these characters at the same age in the same way. So how did he start to adjust them to fit the times?
Yeah. Well, so you certainly see the changes of Charles Schultz's life in the strip itself. There are, speaking of Franklin makes sort of a big comeback in the later years of Peanuts as this confidant of Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown would have some sort of frustration or dilemma, and he would ask Franklin about, what do you think about this? And Franklin would sort of reach back to advice he received from his grandfather. My grandfather used to always say, and it would be some sage advice about life. And I think through that grandfatherly voice, Charles Schultz was articulating sort of wisdom to a younger generation. He was becoming a grandfather by this point. But we also see politics. An interesting thing happened, as you noted, in 1980. Ronald Reagan, former governor of California, gets elected to the presidency and takes the Republican Party and takes the national conversation in a very new direction. Charles Schultz and Ronald Reagan had been friends, correspondents, close acquaintances, I would say. Schultz does go to the White House for a special dinner in his honor, and corresponds off and on with Reagan over the years. In these years, we see Peanuts getting particularly involved in the sort of business boom of the 80s. We see Schultz getting involved in a number of sort of public campaigns, both PSA campaigns and advertising campaigns for businesses like MetLife. To sort of become the friendly face of business in America. So we see Schultz getting involved in those ways. But we also see him, again, that wishy-washiness, pushing back against some of the elements of the 80s and 90s as well. For example, when he offers the Peanuts characters for a Time magazine cover about the place of sex education in public schooling, which was a very controversial issue. Time received a number of letters in the weeks thereafter about, how disappointed they were that the Peanuts characters had been involved in, talking to kids about sex and even sexual identity and HIV and
feminism.
And so. But Schultz believed, that Peanuts had a role in being a responsible sort of spokesperson to the needs of the time. And one of the needs of the time that Schultz was concerned about was kind of adapting our childhood education to the realities of the sexual revolution.
What was he doing that other forms of art and other forms of pop culture couldn't do?
Well, I think first of all, Schultz had and maintained an audience that other mediums could not compete with. Cable television in the 1980s, for example, was blasting apart this sort of monopoly that the national networks had held for decades. There were so many new voices coming into media in the 1980s and 90s that the audience was becoming incredibly stratified. Peanuts, however, was maintaining a daily readership of 100 plus million every day in the United States.
Every other American, right?
Yes. Every other American in 1970, and this continues on into the 80s and 90s, where every other American was reading Peanuts every day. So he had a platform that was really unmatched. It's a holdover from a previous era, but it's unmatched.
It's almost like Facebook is today, right? I mean, maybe Facebook's a little higher, but it's that sort of reach.
Yes, absolutely. And so when Charles Schultz chose to lean his cultural weight into an issue, it mattered. It caught eyes, it caught attention, and it was talked about.
If comics are such a part of pop culture, why has pop culture been so late to explore them?
That's a great question. There's this so I'm this gets into kind of where I'm headed next in my own research as I dig into the history of Batman.
Okay, so I had another question about Batman, but
okay, well, perfect.
But just briefly, why are we hesitant to take on comics as a culture? Is it just because they hold too sacred of a place for us? There's too much nostalgia that we don't want to burst our own bubbles?
Well, I think some of it is we have this sort of long held this long held sense that comics and comic strips are childhood fare, that they're juvenile, and that it's okay for kids, and it's okay for adults to kind of chuckle at and enjoy with their kids, but it's not the topic for serious conversation. Which in reality, that's not how we use these comic strips. Anyways, we use them in sermons, we use them in speeches, we use them in textbooks, and they show up all over the place, but we still act like they're juvenile in some way. I think the other thing is that with comic strips had an element of respectability in that they were in the New York Times, they're in the Washington Post, right? So there is some level
all the news
of respectability. Yeah, right. Comic books, on the other hand, comic books come out of this sort of pulp legacy. They are a little more seedy, a little more, kind of hide in your basement and read these sorts of things. But there's been this real discovery and sort of a liberation in the last 20 years in popular culture, this realizing that, hey, there were a lot of people reading these things and interested in these things that just didn't admit it in public for a long time. And hey, there's like some really innovative and salient reflections on society and human experience going on in these mediums. in part because nobody's taking them seriously, right? So the stakes are kind of low. So they can get into dicey stuff.
Where, one of the things I love looking at when I look at a comic strip or a comic book is the art. Just real briefly, when you look at a piece of comic art, what are you looking for? What makes it fun to look at?
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, you know, like most everyone else, I grew up reading Peanuts in the newspaper, in the tiny little 4 blocks of the weekly news page. And the first time that I ever saw a Charles Schultz original, which are actually done on very large panels. They're done in I don't know the size. It's about
Several feet, though.
Yeah.
Several
Very
feet,
good.
and they actually draw a big thing on several feet and that's just one block.
Yeah, well, yeah. So basically, it would fit on a desktop,
Okay.
kind of big panel, and then they would shrink it down to fit what size the newspaper needed. When you see this in person, the line work, just the precision of how Schultz could feather out these very simple lines, but the curves that he would mention in a number of interviews, just how difficult it is to make Charlie Brown's head round, right, and not have some weird lumps in it, right, or not meet up correctly on one side. And you can see the mastery of it when you look at the original work. So for me, that original work is it's so inspiring, seeing just the level of mastery, but also and I'm seeing this especially in comic book pages. In comic book pages, you see a lot of in those originals, you see a lot of the kind of work that went in, the drafting work and the corrections and the things that go into it. So you see, man, this thing that somebody might read once, wad up and throw in the garbage can is taking hours of artistry to hammer this out and make it exactly so.
Do all the originals still exist? I mean, are these around?
Yeah, so a lot of them, if you go out to the Schultz Museum, a lot of them are still there, and a number of them they've come about different ways. Early on, Schultz would often receive letters. Someone would say, "Hey, I really love this strip, connected with me in this particular way. Is there any way that I could get a signed copy of the original?" And the syndicate they would, depending on what the request was or whatever, Schultz would sign it and they would mail the original off to somebody. It was considered worthless. It was not considered big fare.
Boy, imagine that now, what those would be worth now.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. They can be, the ones that are out there in the wild can be quite expensive. But you're talking about the difference between, Charles Schultz starting in the 50s with the strip running in 7 newspapers to, by the end of his career, the Louvre was doing exhibits on Peanuts and the art of Peanuts. So, I mean,
alongside the Mona Lisa there.
Exactly. Right.
Is that what's in the Louvre? I think it is, right? Yeah, it is. All right. So I feel bad for you because you have to follow up this amazing study with another piece of work, I guess, if you want to keep working, right, in your career. And this is an amazing study, but I'm so glad, and I hope you would come back on to talk about that you are going to be doing a study on Batman. And I love Batman, and I always have. And I, even in the 50s and 60s, I wasn't born yet, but I watched the show from the 50, whatever it is, the 60s, 62 to 64. That was on reruns when I was a kid in the 80s in New York. And I have the DVDs, and I love the Dark Knight trilogy, and I love Batman. And there's a new movie coming out in a few weeks. So explain, why must we know more about Batman?
Wow. Batman, Batman grew up with modern America. He comes out of the dark days of the Great Depression. He is within 12 months of Superman. Together, those two characters created the superhero genre in American literature and in pop culture. Batman intrigues me. I love Superman. I love Wonder Woman, and yeah, I love the Marvel characters. I have always kind of gone for sci-fi and superheroes, but Batman particularly intrigues me in that he's the only one of these characters that has sort of survived through the different eras over the last 80 years. And he's shifted and adapted at points. You know, he becomes a kind of camp comedy in Adam West. And he becomes this very dark political satire in Frank Miller and The Dark Knight Returns. But Batman is the one of these characters that has sort of survived prominently through to our modern era, where superheroes sort of dominate certainly the film and television landscape.
And it's probably Dark Knight is probably the greatest superhero movie ever made.
Sure, absolutely.
Just about.
In fact, in fact, the Dark Knight was such an important film that it forced the Oscars to expand their Best Picture category, because the industry didn't really have a way to fit a movie like The Dark Knight that took the superhero genre extremely seriously. They didn't have a place for that yet, and so yeah, Batman has been a monumental figure in our pop culture. And, you know, it strikes me that's weird. He's a weird character to be so important to us. He's really dark.
We need this as a society for some reason. We need these superheroes. What is that? Why? Why do we need this? I'm digging deep on this right now. I'm working on pitching proposals and things like this. And you know, one of the ways that I'm putting it is, you know, Batman expresses emotions and thoughts and ideas that the other characters like Superman would be perfectly happy to cover over. There are, you know, a hero isn't supposed to be vengeful. A hero isn't supposed to be in it for the gratification that he gets out of stopping evil. He's supposed to be in it selflessly and supposed to be in it, all of these sorts of things. And Batman expresses this sense that, you know, even the greatest among us are damaged, and that's okay. It's okay to be damaged, and it's okay to express our damage and work through it in some messy ways, like punching supervillains in the face. and but there's also a hidden side, and there's a side that he kind of longs to have this, you know, relationship with this sort of devilish female character who's either Catwoman or a lawyer who kind of he feels has wronged him. I guess in the Dark Knight movies, right? I don't remember which one it was, but which movie or whatever, but or which actress it was. But there's always this kind of sense that he's being screwed over. And he has this hidden side to him. No one really knows who he is until he decides to finally blurt it out to somebody.
Yeah, right. Well, and there's this sort of sadistic element to him that he's willing to. He's in the sense that he's willing to be the bad guy. He's willing to be misperceived as this vigilante problem in order to sort of shed light on the corruption and the darkness of the city. And so yeah, he's just this really complex character that again, I think connects with some of our emotions that we like to sort of hide away under our mask.
And you'll take on the movies, you'll take on the comic, you're going to take this character on broadly.
Yeah, I'm a glutton for punishment.
Okay.
Just bring it all on. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it. No pressure, but I can't wait to see this book.
Thank you.
Dr. Blake Scott Ball, the author of Charlie Brown's America, The Popular Politics of Peanuts. Thank you so much for joining us.
So much for having me. This was a great conversation.
I had a great time. I certainly hope this episode isn't Peanuts, right? Check out the book. Check out his formidable Twitter feed, which is at BSB1945. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.